Good morning. You're listening to Retake Our Democracy, a 30-minute weekly show that airs at 8:30 a.m. each Saturday morning on KSFR 101.1 FM, your public Santa Fe public radio station. And I'm Paul Gibson, the host of Retake Our Democracy. And today I'm going to be speaking with Angela Merkert. She's the director of the Alliance for Local Economic Prosperity, the organization leading the charge on trying to get a public bank in New Mexico. Something that Retake Our Democracy strongly supports. We'll get to Angela in just a moment, but first a few short announcements. Just to keep our listeners posted on my progress in recovering from the July 21st stroke, I am well enough to have managed flying to and from Cleveland to visit our grandson, Tori, and to keep up with that energetic 2-year-old. And it was a great trip. And on the whole, I am feeling and doing great, so all systems go, in large part due to Roxanne's patience and support, one day at a time. Last week, I interviewed Mary Feldblum, the director of the Health Security for New Mexicans campaign, and we discussed the status of the health security plan and design process. We discussed, it was a great interview covering the really impressive design process that they've laid out. They're asking a lot of tough questions about exactly how the system would work and answering those questions so that when they come back to the legislature, the legislators won't be asking them, well, how is this going to actually work? They're going to know in detail, not just how it's worked in other countries and other states, but how it would work here in New Mexico. And their process is remarkable. So I'd recommend listening to that. Even if you were listening to it on the radio last time, Mary and I went for at least another 30 minutes after the show concluded. So that video is available on our website. You can get that video and this show by going to retakeourdemocracy.org and going over to the actions and events page and clicking on that, and then clicking on Retake Conversations. And that's where you'll find all of our shows. So I really would recommend that you check that one out, because there's going to be some actions that she describes that are going to be necessary during the Roundhouse session in 2022. I also want to acknowledge that we're conducting this interview on stolen Tewa land and thank our Tewa neighbors for being such good stewards of that land. We owe them a great deal. I also want to remind you that the 2022 legislative session is a bit over 3 months away, and Retake will be operating our legislative alert system again this year. And as in the past, if you're signed up for our alerts, anytime one of our transformational bills is scheduled for a hearing, we send you an alert that includes a bill summary, speaking points, and contact information for your legislator. This year, in part due to the stroke limiting my capacity, and in part due to the fact that it's a short session of only 30 days, we will limit the number of bills we support to far fewer than the 45 we supported last year. We don't want to spread ourselves too thin. You can sign up for the alerts by going to our homepage at retakeourdemocracy.org and look for the red sign up button on the right side of the homepage and click on that and you're in. If you're interested in learning more about how the legislature works and how you can raise your voice more effectively, you should participate in our weekly legislative huddles that will begin in the first or second week of November. Zoom strategy huddles are held every Friday afternoon from 3:30 to 4:30. And these sessions are really important opportunities for you to learn how the legislature really unfolds and where the levers of power are and how you can advocate effectively in this environment. We also, during the session, review what happened the week before. And so that's a good way of understanding better, what just happened and what that means for what's coming. And I see Angela nodding her head. She's a regular participant in our huddles. That's more than, you can sign up for that by going to retakeourdemocracy.org and clicking on the New Mexico legislation in the menu bar, and you'll see a sign up button right there and a form to complete. That's more than enough for now. Let's get started with Angela. I always like to let our guests introduce themselves, Angela. So can you tell us a bit about yourself and how you found your way to advocacy for a public bank in New Mexico?
Certainly, Paul, and thank you for the invitation to join you today. I'm a native Midwesterner, but I've been here in New Mexico for the last 15 years. And I've always been interested in how can we strengthen our democracy and in economic justice. When I lived in Santa Fe, I became acquainted with Craig Barnes and his publication, Democracy at the Crossroads. And I attended that series of lectures and became very engaged in the work that he was doing then. They were just beginning to study public banking when I moved to Albuquerque, but I stayed engaged, and we had a public banking study group going here in Albuquerque as well. So 3.5 years ago, we consolidated those two groups and developed this statewide campaign for a state public bank to address what we see are gaps in the state's finance system.
And we'll wind up talking a bunch about what some of those gaps are during the course of this conversation. To refresh our listeners' minds, can we start by your telling us what happened in the 2021 session and what's coming in 2022? You got a crystal ball, don't you?
Oh, of course, as well as you, right? In 2021, we had sponsors of legislation in the House and the Senate. We had 2 hearings in the House. One we had a do pass, the other the Finance Committee, the bill was tabled. We did a lot of education with legislators through webinars and a number of other meetings. If you recall, that was almost totally virtual. Going forward in 2022, our ideal is to get on the governor's call for the bill to be considered in the short session, and also to have the appropriation of the capital funds that are needed for the bank to be added to the HB2.
Okay. And what is the price tag for that?
Well, the price tag is to allocate or to appropriate $50 million from that 1.4 billion windfall that we have, or from a surplus of the last fiscal year, that would capitalize the bank. And then to the legislation enabling the bank would also move $60 million from one of the Wall Street banks that we currently hold state revenues in, and the state bank would become the depository for those funds. So that would be essentially a shift of funds, but the appropriation would be for 50 million for capitalization.
I see. So I understand that you're trying to utilize the interim committee process to advance things and to educate legislators. How is that process going, and what is it you hope to accomplish by the end of the process?
Well, we hope to accomplish more education and build increased understanding of what the public bank can do among legislators, and to generate more support for the concept of the public bank. We currently are scheduled for 2 different committees. They both happen to be meeting next week. The first one is the Economic Development and Policy Committee meeting that will occur in Clovis on Wednesday, and we'll make a presentation then about especially how the public bank can affect economic development, engagement, and community development in our rural areas. And then on the Thursday, we'll have a presentation to the NMFA Oversight Committee, where we'll describe how, New Mexico Finance Authority Oversight Committee. And in that committee, we will share how the addition of the public bank in the state's finance system can enhance the lending capability of both the NMFA and Economic Development Department.
So one of the things that the chair Lundstrom dinged you for in 2021 was the absence of support from or the presence of state administrators who manage the funds from which you will need funding to launch the bank, to capitalize and to deposit, just to serve as the depositor. Have you made inroads with any of those administrators, and will you engage Representative Lundstrom before the 2022 session?
We will engage Representative Lundstrom prior to that session. And there is a facet of the original plan of 2021 session that has changed in the legislation that we're proposing. We are not proposing to capitalize the bank from state and investment council funds. In other words, not from taking it from one of the permanent funds, because we've developed an expanded understanding of the legislative authority they have to ensure the returns on investment of those funds. We instead are requesting the appropriation of the 50 million, which will not have those stringent expectations, and also the restrictions on investment. Yes, so that has been addressed, and there is no opposition that I've heard of, at least coming from any of the state investment council, on the decision to move that in the other direction.
Interesting. We spoke yesterday, and as I understand it, the creation of the public bank is encountering the same headwind as last year, mostly from the community banks. What is causing their opposition, given that, from what I know, the community banks would stand to benefit tremendously from a public bank? What are their fears, and how are those fears misguided? And lastly, how would community banks benefit from the creation of a public bank?
Those are all great questions, and they leave me puzzled at times myself, Paul, and others of AFLEP. I think that what they have been stating or challenging is that the state public bank will compete with the community banks, and therefore undermine their operational abilities, that it will affect the return on investment for their stakeholders, for their investors. And they also indicate that they are doing a fine job in their communities, that they in fact have funds that are not being used for lending because they don't have lenders for them. In contrast, people from those same communities are telling us that they can't get loans from those banks, and that the requirements are so stringent that there's not, they're just not able to get the funds there. So they're either going to, if for smaller loans, they're going to title companies or title loan companies, or going to their families for developing the resources to start a new business. It's the short-term loans, the longer-term loans, and entrepreneurial loans that are where we see the gap in what's being reported to us, that where the public bank could provide support to the community banks and back them up and help them with collateral so that they can make those loans to the folks in their communities. That we see the community bank being, well, it was a couple of initial benefits for them are, one, the potential of creating new customers, because the interaction for the developing and acquiring the loan is through the community bank, credit union, or CDFI. The potential borrower goes to the community bank. There is no direct interaction with the public bank at all. And then secondly, the community bank benefits because it helps them be more resilient and stronger in their community. One of the challenges of community banks right now in this state, as well as a number of others, is the number of mergers and acquisitions that are going on, and also closings. So we've been losing community banks, and just like we've been losing branch offices of the Wall Street banks.
And pardon my cynicism, but I have a suspicion that the misinformation that the community banks are operating on comes from those Wall Street banks who don't want to see states starting to figure out that they can, put their money in a state bank and do much better than by having it deposited in Wall Street.
And actually, that is a part of the impetus in other states too, about why they want to go into development of either state public banks or municipal or regional banks, because they want more control of the funds. And there are now 22 to 23 banks states that are studying the banks where there's legislation moving. And that's only going to increase, I think, as states want to be able to get more control over their revenues and what happens to them, rather than, we've heard the story about Wells Fargo investing in affordable housing in Germany. Well, why not invest in affordable housing in New Mexico? And we can direct that through placing deposits in our own state public bank, and then develop those lending programs that support affordable housing in our state, where we definitely need it.
Definitely sounds like a win-win.
Yes.
I need to take a short break here to remind our listeners that you're listening to KSFR. It's your local public radio station. And while there's tons of volunteers like myself who help make it go, there's also staff, and there's a recording studio and so forth that all cost money. And so I always like to ask our listeners, when they get done listening to the show, to go to ksfr.org and click on their donate button and make a contribution, and view that as your ticket for admission, just as if you were going to be going to the movie theater. And, so you're paying the freight and keeping the radio station going and keeping shows like this on the air. So I'd encourage you to do that. Today, I'm speaking with Angela Merkert. She's the director of the Alliance for Local Economic Prosperity and one of the leaders of the effort to get a public bank in New Mexico. And we were just talking about the resistance that they're encountering from the community banks, and how it might be fueled by Wall Street. So getting back to the opposition from community banks, I know that similar initiatives are advancing in San Francisco, and I believe Philadelphia, and in, as you mentioned, 22, 23 states. I assume they are encountering some of the same opposition. What are you learning from them?
Yes, that this is definitely expanding. Most recently, the City of Los Angeles City Council voted earlier this week or the end of last week unanimously to go forward with the creation of a public bank, a municipal public bank. If you'll remember, about 4 years ago, they unanimously voted to divest of Wells Fargo for all city revenues. So they are definitely taking some bold steps there. What else we're learning from the other groups is that includes now New York State, New York City, and I mentioned LA. There are several regions of California where there are bank plans being developed, New Jersey. What we're learning from them is that the grassroots coalitions are very important, and each state has its own grouping that's coming out of this. But one of the commonalities is that people and businesses that have been redlined in the past are very interested in this and in the opportunity for bringing more equity into the lending programs of the municipal and the state revenues. They also, it's when people understand how the public bank works and how the notion of keeping the revenue safe, local, and working locally, in contrast to turning it over to Wall Street to invest as they wish and do the profit and glean their profits from that. There's in it a major increase in understanding and a reaction of, well, why shouldn't we do this? You know, what's the downside here? So that's a general reaction as people become educated on what a public bank is and what it can do.
So you're talking about forming alliances in grassroots with organizations that have been redlined or communities. So that's essentially targeting certain sectors. So what sectors or communities are you looking at most?
We're looking at the rural economic development, and also, and that includes especially agriculture and food processing. We're a member of the New Mexico Agriculture Policy and Food Council, and which includes over 30 representation from over 30 organizations.
It's a big group.
It's a big group, and it's a very influential group, and they have a broad range of interests, but they're interested in sustainable agriculture, in looking at new practices for agriculture, especially given this time of climate disruption. And we see that there's going to be even more interest in developing entrepreneurial ideas for how to address these changes in the climate and support communities. And we don't think that the traditional thinking banker is going to necessarily be open to these kinds of ideas, but a state bank can help to back up the lending to these groups or to these individuals to help them foster that. We also know that the average age of the New Mexico farmer right now is 60 and a half years old. We need to develop more expertise and experience and interest in engaging in farming and looking at what and how can be done in a cooperative manner, so that new people coming into the whole agriculture business don't have to heavily invest in, each of them have to heavily invest in very expensive equipment. How can they work through cooperatives to become successful? And the bank can develop programs that support that kind of development too. So there are a number of creative ways through agriculture, through food processing and distribution that we can support and that we want to help foster, and also just keep expanding that into how we work with alternative energy and businesses related to that. Healthy soil is another area that's of interest in the agricultural area. And then associated businesses that can develop from those thriving agricultural, from farming and actually raising the crops. What can be done to add processing and distribution so we're not exporting and then importing so many of our foodstuffs, and that we can deal with it and support our local economies here.
That sounds great. So it sounds to me like and I don't want to overstate this, but it sounds like one of the critical differences between a public bank and the traditional banking system is that a public bank would have a social purpose and would see themselves as partners in the community and problem solving. And your piece would be to add the financing to make the dreams and the aspirations of small business and farmers more realistic, because it's not that they don't have to go to Wall Street for their funding. Is that?
That's exactly right. And also it would be backed up by the kind of governing board that we're proposing, which would include not only bankers and people with strong financial backgrounds, but also people who have strong community development backgrounds, who understand finance, but they also understand how to assess the needs of communities and not focus only on urban development, but looking at a mix of urban and rural, and how is that healthier for our state?
Great. It's just great. This is so obviously a good idea. And yet to be encountering headwinds and opposition seem unfortunate. And also the timing, we talked yesterday, and the timing for this session may not be the best, because as we discussed, the governor's in sort of a difficult bind in an election year, not wanting to trigger the ire of the banking industry and wind up with millions of dollars of bank dark money fueling ads disparaging public banks, and her support as evidence of her being a raving socialist, and then with all kinds of misinformation about the dangers of a public bank. You don't need that either. So what is your strategy for 2022? Are you going to go soft on the governor if she doesn't put it on the call, or are you going to be really pressuring her? And or
I'm
by
not
not
sure.
pressuring her, are you playing for 2023 when she might be happy you didn't?
Well, I don't think it's an either or, Paul. I think that the case can be made for the timing of the bank. We're going to be running out of the federal funds that have been coming into the state for recovery. Those will run out by the end of our fiscal year in June of 2022. The LFC has projected that although we have this windfall of 1.4 billion now, and there will probably be one more strong shot in another year, but then it's going to start to diminish if it doesn't already in this next year ahead. So there are going to be diminishing amounts of revenue coming in from fossil fuels. So how can we lend to the stability of our economic development dollars? We can have, to have the bank enabled through the legislation in the 2022 session, we can have this bank up and running by January of 2023. And it can be positioned to be lending and helping to stabilize and actually increase the amount of funding that's going into economic development from 2023 going forward. And we see that this is a key place where for that tool of the public bank, and the timing is perfect because of the diminishing of those other funds coming in for both recovery and from fossil fuels, and then keeping it up, because we're still going to need, pre-pandemic, we weren't meeting the needs of economic development in the state. And we're not going to be able to meet the financial needs for lending following the pandemic either. By the time we get to 2023, there are going to be more new ideas. There are going to be challenges about what else can we do to address climate disruption, and what are the new ideas that people have. So we need something in place so we don't go into so we can break our cycle of peaks and valleys and stabilize going into that valley for our economic development.
So Angela, we've only got 30 seconds. Can you tell our listeners where they can find out more about public banking and how they can help you?
Absolutely, and thank you. Please go to our website, www.aflep.org, and find out more about our activities, and also consider making a donation to us and supporting the cause for strengthening our state's financial system.
Okay, well, I'm going to come back to Angela in just a minute after we close the show, and that'll be available on the video. But I did want to just thank you for being with us today, Angela, and also to remind our listeners that you really need to continue to stay safe and healthy, wear that mask, do the social distancing thing, get vaccinated, and all of that so you can stay healthy and stay engaged in the change process. If we're not active, we're never going to fix this mess. But if we are, we can fix this mess. So we'll be back again next week, and thank you for listening.
Thank you, Paul.
Okay, by the miracle of podcast, I'm back with Angela Merkert, the director of the Alliance for Local Economic Prosperity. Can you tell us a bit more about some of the strategies you're employing to build organizational and grassroots support? What are you doing to secure that support? And can you talk about how that is going? Where do small business and rural communities see needs that a public bank could address and opportunities for sustainable community development that a public bank could help make happen?
It's a great question, Paul. We are going out into communities with what we call community conversations. Our two outreach coordinators are currently scheduling or meeting with people in Las Cruces, Farmington, Las Vegas, Taos. I'm missing somewhere. We've made, pardon me?
Silver City.
Where we've made contacts in Silver City and Gallup, and there may be something happening in Truth or Consequences, but the intention is to develop these additional contacts through our grassroots groups and through the groups that are endorsing us, identifying individuals in these various communities, and then having them help us make contacts with other both business leaders and also small business owners and entrepreneurs in those communities. And the intention is to engage them and identify what do they see as possibilities for their community. How did they see their communities beginning to advance beyond where they are now? What would be additional factors that could help them thrive even more than they are now? And even in these initial conversations that we've had some amazing suggestions and ideas, and also indications of where the roadblocks are in obtaining the funding. And a lot of that has had to do with more traditional, what I would call traditional perspectives on the funding, and a lack of, and this isn't oriented just to the banks, but it's a lack of imagination about what could be and how do we take risks and look at new possibilities instead of looking at how to keep doing things just as we've always been doing them. And that doesn't mean taking, huge risks. We've done, we've deepened the work on our financial plan. And in our 7-year summary, we show where that $50 million of capital can more than double to 144 million in 7 years, just by retaining earnings and keeping it going. Because remember, that bank can leverage up to 10 times its capital. So if it starts with 50 million, it could actually lend out up to $500 million in loans. So that's appealing to people in our various communities who are saying, we can't get the loan lending, we can't get the financing. There's not enough there there's not enough there.
Okay, that sounds very promising. Am I forgetting to ask you anything? Is there anything else you want to tell our listeners? And now our viewers. Hi, everybody.
I think one thing that's been an interesting insight that I anticipated, but I hadn't heard expressed before, when we've endorsed the National Infrastructure Bank, which is an initiative of a coalition working to get a national bank, which would be the 4th national bank that we've had, because we've had 3 other public banks. And LULAC and Labor have been very active from New Mexico
LULAC?
in supporting that.
Can you tell our
LULAC
listeners?
is, yes, the League of United Latin American Citizens. And it's a civil right, as I understand it through the years, it's a civil rights organization for Latinos and Hispanics. And and what I've heard through those sessions are the stories of what they believe is still redlining for people of color and for women in obtaining small business loans. I know there's been increased attention through the federal funding that's come through Small Business Administration to put more focus on obtaining, getting those loans into the hands of those groups. But it's been interesting to hear the LULAC leadership talk about how they perceive that that's still going on. And I would like, equity in lending is one of the primary principles of the proposed bank as we have developed the business plan.
That's all great. And I'm just hoping that the governor does put you on the call, because I can't wait to come to hearings and see you having lined up these people from rural New Mexico and farmers speaking in favor of what you're doing, and outlining how they haven't been able to get the lending from the community banks. And then you're being able to say how you can partner with the community banks to make it possible for them to actually start making those loans and making those farmers and those rural small business operators better able to build their businesses.
That would be our goal. And that would create communities that are, stronger and more supportive of the well-being of the citizens of those communities. And that only makes for a stronger community and a healthier community in many ways.
It's interesting because I was working on a blog that I hope to publish today, and I'm recording this show on Thursday, by the way. So I was hoping to publish it on Thursday, but it'll be Friday morning. And it's about the degree to which the continued underfunding of government has been this systemic effort to erode public confidence in government's capacity to do anything and to take any kind of a bold step. And it's like a retreat from FDR, and it's been funded by the Koch brothers and so forth. And because of it, things like the Health Security Act and public banking and initiatives that take us in a new direction face headwind from people who are just timid and afraid, well, we can't do that. How can we do that? We got to let the private sector do this. And the privatization has prioritized profit over people and planet. And that's why I like the idea of the public bank having this social dimension. So
it definitely does. And that's been a part of the attraction for me in engaging in this whole campaign, is because it isn't just about the money. It's about what can the money do for us and with us, and enhance the well-being of our people. And that's what it's all about. It's not for the accumulation of it. It's how can we use it more wisely to, I know the phrase for the common good isn't all that popular with many people right now, but it's been instilled with me since I was a child. And how can we use our resources for the common good?
Well, we keep straying from that because we like the idea of survival of the fittest, and the people who work the hardest get the most, and they deserve it. And we forget about the common good in that pursuit of profit. And so it's wonderful to have a banker who's got that social purpose in her head. So thank you, Angela, for taking the time to do this. And we'll have this up on the website and a link to you. I'll get a link to you maybe even later today, but I'd rather you didn't post it until after the radio show airs on Saturday morning. But we'll have it out there for you listeners too on retakeourdemocracy.org at the actions and events page, and just look for Retake Conversations, and we'll be back again next week, probably with another person bringing forward ideas for the 2022 session, because we're getting started. Thank you, Angela, and have a great weekend.
And thank you, Paul.
Okay. Bye-bye.